You will actually have to, I'm feeling in a bit of a vulnerable situation because in a way we're going from the sublime to the ridiculous, coming after Alice and Uma. And I'm going to take the easy way out, I think, and that is by actually reading a paper that I have bothered to pen, partly because I wanted to try and focus it and did have certain things in mind. To some of you from Pakistan and certainly others from South Asia, some of this ground would be familiar, but I am, and I would like you to indulge me, because I would like to reach out to a younger generation that is here, that actually does not know this history, even of the movement in Pakistan. So that's one note of sort of some apology. I think it's very unfortunate, in fact, that we don't carry that history and that there is this fragmentation and dislocation. And not only do we have to reinvent the wheel every time men are in our audience, but we often have to reinvent the wheel within the women's movement. I carry within me the fatigue or the accumulated fatigue of a country trying to find its bearings for the last 53 years since independence. I carry my own fatigue of fighting as a student activist the martial law of General Ayub Khan from 58 to 69, of trying to mobilize against the martial law of General Yahya Khan, 1969 to 71, when the army was unleashed against the people of East Pakistan and rape was a part of military strategy. I found myself in opposition to the civilian dictatorship of Prime Minister Zadeh Bhutto and fought against the military regime of General Ziaul Haq from 77 to 88. The 11 years, 88 to 99, of 4 elected governments and 3 interim ones, again found many of us on the battle lines, particularly during the 2 regimes of Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, with 1999 bringing the confrontation to literally a life and death situation. For the Institute of Women's Studies Lahore that I represent, and myself personally, that year was particularly difficult with the Nawaz Sharif government initiating a vicious campaign against us. The Institute and myself by name were continuously accused, among other things, of being anti-state, anti-government, anti-Islam, anti-military, of leading women astray, of immorality, debauchery, of being pro-Hindu and pro-Jewish. Most of it is correct, actually. We did have 4 different police and military intelligence agencies, some of them you'll probably see hanging around here, including the military intelligence, the inter-services intelligence, and we were asked in 1969, we were monitored by the military itself. We had 6 army trucks and jeeps standing outside our building. 99. A minister of the provincial government also made repeated calls through the press for the public to burn our building down and our homes and to literally skin us alive. We received threats and were followed by right-wing militants. Women's groups, NGOs and the press to a large extent came out and supported the Institute. All the leading English dailies wrote supportive editorials and the monthly news magazines denigrated the government. The government had not expected this support. Its tactic, perhaps, was to single out one organization, isolate it and force it to close down, with the intent that others may simply get scared and back off from similar political activities. The interesting thing in this, however, and it is a point that I take some satisfaction in, is that it was said very categorically that the Institute of Women's Studies, since it teaches women's studies, is the most subversive organization in Pakistan because women's studies is subversive. I thought that was very flattering, and I thought the government had understood something that the women's movement had not understood. Since the type of attack that was actually was not supported, and that the institute actually did stand firm on its ground, the government then attacked other women's organizations, or a foundation was attacked for anti-government activities. NGOs, particularly women's organizations and the press, were perceived as the last bastions of opposition, a position that far outweighs their size or their ability to destabilize the government. But to the extent that they voice opposition and try to alert the public, and further since they confront the government on the streets, in the press and even in court, this opposition is perceived as a threat. Intelligence agencies continued that year to harass women's groups and NGOs, and Islamic fundamentalist and militant organizations continued to threaten and intimidate these groups. In May 1999, the government again started its verbal campaign and harassment, this time also on television, and attacked Dastak, a women's refuge, Shirkatgah, Ajoka, a women's theatre group, the Human Rights Commission of Pakistan, AGH, a women's law firm, and ASR and the Institute again. All of these are women's organizations, all led by women. The accusations and language used was again emotive, pro-West, pro-Indian, anti-Islam, against Islamic values, foreign agents, national integrity, immorality, etc. In April 1999, a young woman was murdered by her parents in the office of her lawyer, Hina Jilani, because she had approached the lawyers to assist her in getting a divorce. Since she was a Pathan and came from the Northwest Frontier province, the supposedly secular party in the frontier supported the murder as being part of its tradition of honor killings. The murderers have not been arrested as yet, and in a strange twist of justice, arrest warrants were issued on the lawyer by some other young woman had approached. This experience, however, needs to be contextualized, as indeed Pakistan itself needs to be, since whatever is or may have happened in Pakistan has not occurred unrelated to regional and global imperatives. I'm not suggesting that all expression of nationality, religion, race, identity and culture are part of a global conspiracy. Yet Islamic fundamentalism, which most concerns me today, was created and encouraged by global capitalism, particularly by the United States, for its own ideological, political and economic purposes. For the people of these countries where Islamic fundamentalist regimes were imposed and supported, this meant two things. One, that a monolithic and one-dimensional Islam was forced upon them, and secondly, that this imposition of a repressive and narrowly defined Islam led to intense divisions within these countries because of the various sects and multiple interpretations that exist within Islam. Pakistan was one of the countries where an Islamic fundamentalist regime was forced upon the people in 1977 and which was supported militarily and economically by the United States to fight communism in Afghanistan. Perhaps it is in order at this point to state that despite the present position of the Pakistani state, Pakistan was not intended to be an Islamic republic, and in further that its identity as an Islamic republic has been and continues to be contested. Indeed, the first constitution of Pakistan, passed in 1956, while declaring Pakistan to be an Islamic republic, separated religion from the state by emphasizing that the Almighty Allah has given temporal authority to the people as a sacred trust. Affirmative action for women was recognized in this constitution by giving women 2 votes, one for the general constituency and one for seats reserved for women. The constitution was never put in place. The army took over in 1958 and sought to modernize and liberalize Pakistan by opening the doors to capitalist development. General Ayub Khan made changes in the Islamic personal law by promulgating a Muslim family laws ordinance, which gave rights to women within a liberal interpretation of Islam. Pakistan still has perhaps one of the more liberal personal laws in the Muslim world. The position of women was further strengthened under Prime Minister Zadeh Bhutto, who was liberal and progressive in terms of women's rights. All services and professions, with the exception of the armed services, was open to women. In the Mexico Conference in 1975, Mrs. Bhutto declared that the People's Government of Pakistan was fully committed to complete equality, emancipation and integration of women in the development process. Bhutto was deposed in 1977. 1977 was a turning point in Pakistan. General Ziaul-Haq declared martial law and justified his takeover by saying that he had to Islamize Pakistan. Apart from the support of the United States and other Western countries in the military, he was supported by Islamic fundamentalist parties, and the Jamaat-e-Islami joined his government. The state, in giving voice to the clergy, has created its own nemesis. While not being able to convert the nation or to bring about any fundamental changes in its capitalist economy, Ziaul Haq concentrated on issues such as Islamic punishments, on legal changes, and on refining the definition of Islam and what it means to be a Muslim. Fasting in Ramzan, saying one's prayers, being forced to give charity in the exact percentage determined by Islam became the parameters of being a Muslim, while the larger morality got lost in the ritual. In separating the wheat from the chaff, non-Muslims were completely marginalized and now are only nominal citizens. However, the linchpin of this process of Islamization was women. In his first address to the nation, Ziaul Haq vowed to uphold the sanctity of the Chadar and the Chardivari, the veil and the four walls. The state moved to take over the lives of women, to control their bodies, their space, to decide what they should wear, how they should conduct themselves, the jobs they could take, the sports they could play, and it took it upon itself to define and regulate women's morality. This was done through a series of legislative changes such as the Zina and Hudud ordinances and the Islamic law of evidence, through directives such as the dress code, and women were not being allowed to participate in spectator sport, but mainly through a persistent ideology that women were not equal to men and that they must be regulated. Indeed, the women's movement did not confine itself, the women's movement, to women's issues. I beg your pardon, I missed out a paragraph. All of this galvanized women into coming together and forming the Women's Action Forum, which was then an alliance of several women's groups and individuals. Since then, women's organizations have fought every anti-woman measure, and the first demonstration against martial law and Islamization was a women's demonstration in 1983 against the proposed law of evidence, which stipulated that the evidence of two women would be equal to that of one man. Despite state repression and state violence, the women's movement grew in size, with several groups and organizations being formed. Indeed, the women's movement did not confine itself to women's issues. Women were not only in the forefront of the movement for the restoration of democracy, but also emerged as leaders of the peace movement, particularly between India and Pakistan, the environment movement, within the trade unions. They were the first to challenge injustice through public interest litigation, for example, on bonded labor, by forming NGOs, and many women played key roles as journalists and editors of major newspapers and journals. While admittedly these were mainly middle-class professional women, one of the largest organizations then was the Sindhiani Tehreek, or Sindhi Women's Movement, which had an active membership of over 15,000 mainly peasant women. What is of importance, nevertheless, was the role that women played as opposed to their male counterparts. I would suggest that this reinforces the argument that not only did women bear the brunt of Islamization, but that men were not only not threatened by it, but since patriarchy and masculinity was reinforced by the state, many men even collaborated, at least by their silence. This is not to suggest that men were not fighting against martial law, but only to say that women were fighting both martial law and Islamization and have continued to fight on several fronts. Ziaul Haq was killed on August 17, 1988, and a woman Prime Minister, Benazir Bhutto, elected in November of that year. Since then, Pakistan has had 4 elected governments and 3 interim ones, a total of 7 and 11 years, with the military coup and the present military government here since 1999. Given the history of direct military rule and a clause inserted by Ziaul Haq in the Constitution, which until recently allowed the President to dismiss a government, the parliamentary system or other form of civilian government has never been allowed to take root in Pakistan. This does not suggest that the governments were not corrupt, inefficient and self-seeking, only that the electoral system has never been allowed to take its course. As far as women were concerned, there was a difference in Benazir's 2 tenures and that of Nawaz Sharif's. Benazir Bhutto never had a 2/3 majority in parliament to overturn the anti-women legislation by Ziaul Haq, but instinctively she allowed a greater space and a freedom to express women's concerns. Nawaz Sharif, on the other hand, passed another Islamic amendment in 1991 in his first tenure and was in the process of passing the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, which in effect would have made the Prime Minister of the Federation the supreme interpreter of the Quran and Sunnah, literally the commander of the faithful. This would have led to a process where the Pakistani state would be very akin to Saudi Arabia, with all religious and temporal authority concentrated in a single person. Women's organizations, NGOs, and the English language press vociferously opposed these measures, and indeed it is perhaps the movement's success in not letting it become law, and in raising awareness and mobilizing the public against the nuclear test and nuclear proliferation that also triggered off the massive attack on women's groups. The last 22 years or 23 years now of Pakistan fall into two fairly neat phases: 11 years of Zia's martial law, 11 years of parliamentary democracy, and the last year and a half of another martial law. It's just technicality that they don't call it that, but a rose by any other name or a thorn by any other name is still a thorn. The women's movement can also be seen in two distinct phases, partly because the lifting of martial law broadened the focus and the strategies of the movement, and also, post-Nairobi, there was a global trend towards mainstreaming. The 1980s also gave rise to debates among feminists on the end of ideology, reform versus revolution, the difference debate, the concept of religious specificity, gender, etc. While feminist academics and the women's movement in Pakistan were not, by and large, aware of these debates, the positions came through in diluted and often distorted forms through the donor community, the World Bank, United Nations, and bilateral assistance. And dependence on funding and on the agendas of the funding agencies, and indeed the scale of funding, changed the nature of the women's movement in Pakistan and elsewhere. In Pakistan, for example, the dynamic, spontaneous, non-funded, politically oriented and feminist organizations such as Women's Action Forum and Sindiani Tehreek gave way to non-ideological women's rights groups. While militant and feminist groups continue to exist, even we in ASR and Institute are under pressure to either change our orientation and our politics or simply to cease to exist for lack of funds or because we are considered passé. In other words, while women in Pakistan have fought a brave and courageous struggle and is today acknowledged by the United Nations and governments and other institutions, the negative aspect of this support has been that the women's movement itself has lost its political edge and in many cases its commitment. This trend has led to some powerful groups becoming not only part of the establishment, but has led to these groups taking on the very male, hierarchical, mainstream norms that they were earlier challenging. What is even more unfortunate is that the women's movement has begun to be defined only by a few women-centered groups, mainly in the urban areas. This has tended to exclude and to overlook the efforts that women have been making and do continue to make all over Pakistan in their own areas of work or expression, and this in turn has meant that the media, the government, international agencies, and even these organizations believe that it is only they who give legitimacy to the movement. There is, however, little validity in the assumption that the interests, issues, understanding, and in some cases sophistication of urban professional groups are different from those women not considered part of the movement. If anything, experience shows that women from different class, ethnic, religious, and professional backgrounds are much more able and willing to understand and grapple with issues of their own subordination. For example, it is often said by urban professional women or women's rights groups that the women's movement cannot be very political or confrontational or secular or conceptual or feminist because some average woman is not ready for this. Yet we have often found that these women are much more willing and able to understand and identify with these notions than middle-class urban women, and that these women are more willing to travel long distances, put up with uncomfortable situations, take leave from their work, stay away from their families, and even take enormous personal risks to be part of something they believe in. To them, the issue of class contradictions in society, the patriarchy inherent in all religions, militarization, poverty, unemployment, suppression of creativity, etc., are not just concepts. They deal with these issues on a daily basis. They are therefore much more interested in why this happens and how it might be resolved. Recently, there have been some attempts at redefining the women's movement in Pakistan by including development activities and projects. In many cases, however, projects, programs and action plans have subsumed and or negated the very activism and commitment that the movement is premised on. These initiatives have, in a concrete sense, depleted much of the dynamism, energy and flexibility of the movement. For example, or in some instances, these activities are financially supported, which invariably brings with it the constraints of paperwork, proposals, reports, accounts, etc., quite apart from the fact that often activities get defined by the agendas and constraints of the funding agencies. Paid political and social activism, whether it is in academia, NGOs, women's groups, or the press, or other institutions that supposedly work in the public interest, also gives a false sense of commitment and fulfillment. If, for example, one is spending several hours a day doing good works, there is a tendency to switch off when one is free. Activism in this sense has increasingly become a job or a task, and issues and actions are not necessarily internalized. This not only leads to a further fragmentation of the self into a false consciousness, but by reinforcing the separation of the public and the private, it negates what the women's movement was always trying to do. The women's movement has moved from being a movement to becoming institutionalized and becoming part of the establishment. I'm not actually going into too much detail here. I have a few pages on this and I'm skipping it. But when I say that it has become part of the establishment, it is quite literal at this stage in Pakistan, with many women's groups having joined the government either as ministers or in task forces or advisory committees, etc. So they are actually part of the government today. The antithesis, in other words, has therefore been through the synthesis and is increasingly becoming the thesis. Women's groups are now institutions, feminists are members of the establishment, women's studies is rapidly being incorporated in many universities, women's lists are carried by mainstream publishers, women's issues, of course, are addressed by government, and of course, not only is March 8th taken over by the government of Pakistan and I guess elsewhere, but 12th February has been taken over by the government of Pakistan, which is Pakistan Women's Day. What has often been identified as the second wave of feminism started in the 1960s for two decades, perhaps until Nairobi. It was a vibrant political movement that sought to challenge not only patriarchy at all levels, but to challenge the existing socio-political and economic structures, from the family to the state and to international institutions. Indeed, its most profound critique was of patriarchy and of the state and international structures. It was also extremely dynamic in that it accepted nothing as the norm and opened up new territories, spaces, choices, and alternatives. Those of you active then will recall that women went to Nairobi as a coming together of women in an international women's movement seeking and understanding political alliances and common struggles among themselves. Most of us were oblivious of the UN conference and in any case were critiquing not only our nation states but the United Nations itself. Nairobi should have been a watershed for a stronger women's movement, and had it been, we today may not have been saying, in despair, that not much has changed since Beijing. History is made by people's movements. People propel history forward by confronting the status quo. History is never made by collaborating, a derogatory term at best, or by being in partnership with the oppressor, or by lobbying. The term and process of lobbying, incidentally, is very disturbing. It comes out of the American political system where people get paid by interest groups to hang around in the lobbies of power to further their interests. It is most unfortunate that this very base aspect of the American political system has been taken over by social activists, often to the exclusion of all other political activity. In any case, it seems ironic to me that if we identify the state, the global institutions, including the UN, and patriarchal forces as the oppressors, that is, if we identify them as the problem, that we then expect them to be the solution. The question is whether we have this critique any longer of patriarchy, the state, or the UN, or whether we are only interested now in being included in the system. Certainly we are part of the system, as academics, NGOs, as paid social activists, dependent on resources from these very institutions and the United Nations and our nation states, following agendas already decided within spaces already determined. Apart from the critique of patriarchy in the state, we in Asia no longer critique the family and seem to have totally discarded the feminist critique of marriage. Sexuality and the institution of marriage is the seat of women's oppression. By moving away from discussions, debates, positions, and encouraging alternative ways of relating, we not only reinforce patriarchy and the heterosexual family, which with single-headed households is no longer even the norm, but reinforce the dichotomy of the public and the private. The issue of sexuality is also important since the religious right and conservatives are preoccupied with the female body and female sexuality. By shying away from discussing this and positioning ourselves on this crucial aspect of women's oppression, we strengthen patriarchy by our silence and also internalize the shame that we are meant to feel regarding our own bodies and our sexuality. Not addressing these issues also leads to the extreme homophobia in the Asian women's movement, where lesbian women will be at best be encouraged to be silent or will be marginalized if they are not. Religious identity and religious conservatism, or worse, the strategic use of religion, also dogs the women's movement in the South. Speaking of secularism is discouraged, and being able to declare oneself an atheist is anathema. This has stifled debate on a crucial issue, not only because it has defined religion as the only parameter, but also has led to a reinforcement of religious identity which is liable to be tapped by the state or religious forces. Indeed, women's groups trying to understand or use religion strategically have been no more successful in mobilizing women than secular groups. Instead, they may well have played into the hands of the religious right by not opposing more directly the use of religion. Perhaps the most conservative part of this aspect of this movement in the last 16 years has been the shift from feminism to gender. Feminism, very simply, is the recognition of patriarchy as a system of male oppression and domination which has a material, that is, an economic base. Feminists therefore seek a more holistic and structural transformation of society and a transformation of all relationships, including the personal. The women's rights movement is a necessary stage towards this transformation, just as a democratic liberal stage may be necessary for a greater social and economic structural transformation in general. But as far as feminism is concerned, equal rights within the existing system is not an end in itself. This requires an autonomous feminist movement that challenges patriarchy by first providing a space for women to articulate their own oppression from and by men. Under the influence of the donor community and the imperatives of funding, but also to avoid vulnerability and or marginalization, a large number of feminists and women's activists have begun to use the word gender in place of women while discussing the issues of equality and women's rights. Women's equality has given way to gender equality, women's consciousness has become gender consciousness, and awareness of women's issues has become gender awareness. Feminist thought has gone from being alternative and oppositional to mainstream and establishment, and development agencies like the World Bank, the IMF, have appropriated the language of feminism and co-opted it into their own discourse. The problem with the notion of gender is that it can mean both men and women, or either man and woman. The specificity of women's oppression then disappears. In development jargon, gender implies that both men and women are equally oppressed by a strict sexual division of labor, and that emancipation of both is necessary for society to be free. While it is true that men are also locked in strict masculine feminist divisions, the important fact is that they are the ones who stand to gain. The impression of equality or equal oppression created by this highly neutralized term obfuscates the fact that women are oppressed and subjugated by men. Men gain from patriarchy, women lose. It is recognized by most feminists that patriarchy cuts across the barriers of class, race, region, ethnicity and religion and is universal. The notion of gender denies patriarchy and in doing so denies structure. In any patriarchal structure, women occupy the lower and subordinate positions and men are more powerful. By denying the structure of power, the neutral word gender depoliticizes the issue of women's subservience. This notion has been derived from liberal philosophy in which all ideas have equal validity and all groups, regardless of their social position, are accorded a morally equal status. For example, in moral terms, workers cannot be equated with capitalists since workers are exploited and capitalists are exploiters who gain from that relationship. In this structure, one party rules over the other and uses it for its own ends. Patriarchy is a similar structure, but the word gender implies that women and men are two equal entities facing each other in a non-confrontational position. In fact, men and women stand in a relationship of mutual conflict, as their interests are not the same. In simple terms, men are not equally oppressed. In the structure then of social relations, they are positioned differently from women. Notions of gender training and gender sensitization fail also to take into account the vastly different positions from which men and women come. Such activities operate on the assumption that gender oppression is a result of social attitudes, beliefs, religious ideology, and cultural values, an assumption supported by liberal disciplines such as social psychology. The material basis of patriarchy, the fact that men control and own most of the world's resources, including those produced by women, is denied in this discourse. As long as men control economic and survival resources, no amount of awareness and sensitization is going to make a difference in relationships between women and men. The one who owns will inevitably control and use the one who doesn't. Without challenging the material basis of patriarchal relations, gender sensitization and awareness will not change power relations in society. Assuming that they will is equivalent to saying that by making capitalists and workers aware of and sensitive to exploitation involved in their relationship, they will both realize what is happening and decide to change things. Economic, political, and material struggles are necessary since no group ever renounces power. As Sunila Abisekra, a Sri Lankan friend, once said to me, one needs to be wary that the process of engendering does not lead to women being endangered as a species. As one who is despairing of the way the world has turned over the last decade or so, and as one who strongly believes that a socialist feminist ideological position and struggle is essential to fight capitalism and fundamentalist ideologies, I leave you with 4 questions which are applicable to all of us. 1. Will the women's movement or feminist activia continue if funds are no longer available? 2. Will collaboration, partnership, lobbying, and handouts from the state bring about the changes that we seek in reality and on the ground without a simultaneously active, autonomous feminist, socialist, and anti-racist movement to challenge and confront the global class, patriarchal, and hegemonic structures? 3. If we do not have an ideological position, will we ever get the energy, the commitment, and the resistance to fight patriarchy and bring about the structural changes that we seek? And 4. When academics and NGOs really begin to challenge the status quo or are being perceived to do so, will the state or the UN allow them to continue? The political space is being restricted in many countries, and in Pakistan we have seen a full-scale attack on women-centered NGOs and feminist academics. What will these institutions do in this case? Backtrack, compromise, negotiate a space, or continue with their confrontation regardless? As we enter the new millennium, I strongly believe that it is time to take stock and to re-examine what we are doing and why. I believe we need to get back and re-look at the critiques and the principles of feminism and Marxism and the feminist and socialist movements. I have faith that fundamentalism, conservatism, and patriarchy can be challenged by a counter-ideology and by a continued struggle on all fronts. I believe we need a new all-encompassing dream. I still try to cling to mine, for as Langston Hughes, the Black American poet, said, hold fast to dreams, for when dreams die, life is a broken-winged bird that cannot fly.